Micah Riescher and Marcelo Raffo. They run over Relo Andes and the Southern Cone, so pretty much all of South America is in the jurisdiction of Relo Andes. So this is the first webinar in our series, just to give you an idea of what to expect with the Relo Andes webinars. We will be holding these every month for English teachers, English students, anyone interested in professional development for English teaching. The nice thing about these webinars being brought from Relo Andes is that they are contextualized for Latin America. All of the presenters that we'll be having are currently residing and living and working in Latin America. But the topics that you will hear about are generally applicable to any educational context. We want these webinars to be as interactive and as engaging as possible. So we depend on your participation and your feedback as much as we can get it to make them best for you. The format of the webinars will run for approximately 30 minutes. We know that teachers have very busy schedules, so we're trying to keep it short so that it's something that all teachers can fit into their busy days. So today's presentation will run approximately 30 minutes. If you have to go after the 30 minutes, you're free. But if you have time at the end, there will be maybe 10-15 minutes at the end for some questions and answers that might come up throughout the presentation. Just a suggestion for how to watch this webinar in order to get the most out of it. Many people have told us that the best experience for them is to watch it with their colleagues and to form a viewing party, so that at the end, aside from the discussions and interaction that we do in the webinar, you can also talk about it with the people that you're viewing. So just to introduce myself, my name is Maggie Steingraeber. I am a fellow here in Lima. I have been in Lima for about 2 months now, and I am working on a lot of projects with curriculum design and teacher training throughout, with the ministry throughout the different regions in Peru. I am originally from Wisconsin, and I've worked in several countries throughout Asia and Latin America. Since for a lot of you this may be the first time that you have participated in a webinar, or maybe you've participated in them before but with different software. The software that we're using is through a company called Citrix called GoToWebinar. So I'm sure when you registered you saw either of those names. That is the company that is providing the software for us. So when you got the download requirement, that's what you saw it was. So if you've managed to attend, then that means you did it correctly. Congratulations. So like we said, we want this to be as interactive as possible. The software allows several opportunities for interaction and engagement with you, the attendee, and us, the presenters. So before we begin, I want to walk you through what some of them are, just so that you see how to use them and that you practice using them before we begin. So first, you'll see your panel, which I'm sure looks something very similar to what I have here. This should be what you're seeing. The first that you'll see on top is if you want to expand or collapse this panel. If you find it distracting, You can collapse it. If you like having it there, leave it open. It won't affect how you experience the webinar. It's personal preference. Below it is full screen mode. You can enter in so that it fills your whole screen so that you don't have any distractions on the side. You'll see that your microphone is muted. So if you're talking right now, I cannot hear you. Don't worry, we're not listening. If it says unmuted, we are, but we will not do that just with connectivity issues. For any presentation, microphones will always be muted. Now for the engagement tools, ways that you can interact with us. So I'm sure you've seen down here the questions box and any questions that you have for us. This is the chat box. So if you have any questions for us, any comments that you'd like to make, you can type them directly into the chat box and they go to us, the organizers. Unfortunately, or fortunately, other people cannot see it, so it does not allow for communication with all attendees. But we can see questions that may come up. If you're having technical issues, type them in the box. We'll be able to see them. Once the presentation gets going, if you have questions that come up about the content, you can type them in there as well. Questions might not be answered until the end, depending on the topic, but we will see them and we will address them when we can. So just to practice the chat box, if you want to come to your keyboards, if you're not already there, and type message here, just tell us who you are and where you are joining us from, just so we can practice everyone typing into the chat box. All right, we have a lot of people joining us. Nicaragua, we have Jenny in Piura, Lisa in Piura, Christian in Cusco, Venezuela, all right, Ricardo in Lima, Trujillo, all right, looks like a lot of people from Nicaragua and Piura and Lima, Peru. Excellent, some Ecuador, Maricela from Trujillo, hello, nice to see you. All right, excellent, all right, and Poland, all right. International Beach, Bolivia. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Excellent. Perfect. Okay. And Colombia. Okay. So that's the chat box. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to type questions. Again, like I said, we may not answer your questions until the end, but they're there and we will address them when we can. If technical issues do arise, please feel free to type them in and those we will address as soon as they arise. The next one is the hand raising feature. Some of you may have seen this. This is what this little hand looks like here. So the idea of this tool is to simulate what it would look like in a classroom. When you want to be acknowledged by the teacher, you would raise your hand for a question or for a comment. With the amount of attendees that we have, raising your hand for a question to be called on isn't going to work. So instead, questions use the chat box, but we will use the hand raising feature just for asking general questions and getting quick polls on people. So just to practice with the hand raising, if you see that tool, can you please raise your hand? If you are sitting in the room with your hand physically in the air, you're doing it wrong. Let's see. All right. Looks like a lot of you got it. Excellent. All right. All right, so that is hand raising. Throughout the presentation, I may ask you to raise your hand just to do a quick survey on how you feel about a certain topic, if you know about something. So that is how you do it, and it looks like most of you found it. That is excellent. Okay, perfect. Down. Okay. Next is polls. So polls, as they sound, are things that are through that we want to ask you questions, we want to see, gauge your interest in something. We might ask you for a poll. So for this poll, so I'm going to give you a quick poll just so that you practice with doing it. I want to know what type of educational institution do you work at? So are you a primary school teacher, a secondary school teacher, university or tertiary education, adult education, or other if you're working in a private institute or wherever else you're joining us from? So I'll give you just a couple seconds, maybe about 30 seconds, and just let us know what setting do you teach at? All right, so let's see the results. It looks like the majority of you are secondary or university teachers. So 31% secondary school, 33% university. A lot of people other, and we do have a few primary school teachers joining us. So welcome to everyone. So that is how the polls work. The other tool that you see that we won't be using for you is the drawing tool. These are to make quick scribbles on the screen. We won't be using them in this webinar, but it is possible for drawing and if you would like to indicate things. All right. The next type of engagement tool that we have is handouts. So you can see on your sidebar, there is a handout with a 1 next to it. These provide you with any handout that the presenter would like you to have. So in this case, we're giving you the slides to this presentation. So after the presentation's over, if you would like to download the slides and keep them with you for looking at them later or for discussion, if you're in group, you have the capability to download them in the PDF format. And future presenters might also have you put up different documents, whatever it may be. That is where you find any handouts that we'd like to share with you. And finally, the last type of engagement tool that we have to share with you are surveys. There will be a survey at the end of this presentation, so once the webinar is finished, it will just ask you, we only have 2 questions now, what we're interested in knowing from you, where you're joining us from, and how many of you are watching this together. So at the end of the survey, please stay for just a couple seconds and just answer that question for us so that it can help us be better informed about where you're coming to us from and how you're experiencing this webinar. So those are the engagement tools that come with the software. Once again, if you have any questions on how they work or you're having any technical problems throughout, please feel free to type into the chat box and we will get back to you as soon as possible with an answer or a solution to the problem that you're having. All right. Then with that, we will begin this week's topic, which is creating a positive learning environment. Again, my name is Maggie Steingraeber. I'm an English language fellow out of Relo Andes in Lima, Peru. So we all know that learning a foreign language is difficult. Any language that you learn is very difficult, and students feel very uncomfortable and sometimes embarrassed when they're asked to speak in front of the class, in front of the teacher. In any situation, producing language can cause a great deal of anxiety. So it's important to make students feel comfortable in the classroom, not only with the teacher, but also with each other. The more students feel at ease, the more likely they'll be to communicate freely and to take risks with the language, because in the end, language is about communication. And the more people feel safe to communicate and comfortable communicating, the more likely they are to produce language and to communicate. And that's what we as English teachers ultimately want them to be doing. So the inspiration for this topic came from a very recent experience that I had from a student perspective. So I'll give you a little background on my inspiration for this topic. Like I said, I arrived to Lima about 2 months ago, very positive attitude, and I was new to the city. It's a big city, so I really made an effort for socializing and finding ways to acclimate myself into a new setting. So I was looking for different social groups to join as a way to meet people and get a feel for my new surrounding. So I joined a recreational class of a hobby that I'd been practicing for many years and that I had always enjoyed doing. Unfortunately, the experience was not very positive. The instructor offered very unnecessary critiques of my performance. I often felt singled out and received a lot of very negative feedback from her. I always felt whenever I went to the class like I was doing something wrong. After this happened repeatedly, I found myself not wanting to go to the class, and when I did go, I wouldn't enjoy it as much. The enjoyment that I once felt for it had been sucked out, and when I would go, I wouldn't push myself very hard. I would try to blend in, I wouldn't take risks, out of fear of that negative criticism coming back. So, being the reflective practitioner that I am, I reflected on the experience and really wanted to get to the root of the issue of how something that I had enjoyed had become something that I no longer liked. So I started to research the effects of teacher beliefs on student outcome and performance, and the effects that different types of feedback have on students. So today's topic and the information that I'm going to talk about is not new. It's not an innovative topic. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's a real experience that I had and that had an impact on my professional practice. And I think as educators, part of our job is to really reflect on our experiences, both as teachers and if we're in situations where we're learners, and share our ideas with each other, because that's how we develop and that's how we become better at what we do. And the more we share with each other, the better we all are in hearing different perspectives. So this idea kind of gets to the heart not only behind today's topic, but also behind the whole series, where we're asking people, teachers, educators, to come and share their experiences and share their ideas. So with that, I will start with the information. I want to start first with just an activity that's going to explore the idea of prejudices and I'd like you to just judge them. Make assumptions about how you think they would be, what would their character be like if they were a student in your classroom. If it's the first day of school and you see them, what assumptions would you make about their behavior? How well or not well would they behave? Their effort, how hardworking do you think this student is? And finally, their intelligence. How high of a performer do you think this student is? So if you're watching with others, I'll show you a picture and I'll give you a couple seconds to discuss ideas. If you're watching on your own, take that time to just think in your head. Again, I'll show you 3 different students and I'd like you to judge them based on how would she behave in your class, how hard would she work in your class, and how intelligent do you think she is? And we'll do the same with student 2. Again, behavior, effort, and intelligence. And student 3, what do you think about student 3? Behavior, effort, intelligence. Okay. So you have the 3 students. All right, so we'll just go through with each student. All right, so what did you think about student 1? You can, well, what was student 1? Student 2, a lot of you said student 2 looks very naughty. All right, let's talk student 1 first. Student 1, what do you think about student 1's behavior? Would you think that student 1 would be well behaved, or do you think you'd have discipline problems with student 1? Well behaved. Mildred Mendoza says well behaved. She's adorable. She is kind of adorable. Well behaved. All right. What about her effort? Do you think she would try hard? A lot of you think student 1 would be a good student. Positive attitude, well behaved. Excellent. What about her intelligence? Do you think she'd be at the top of the class or maybe towards the bottom, middle? A lot of people saying she looks intelligent, she looks self-motivated, towards the top of the class. All right. Julio thinks she'd be a hard worker, positive attitude. Very good. Excellent. Self-confident. Okay. What about, all right, we'll take a poll. So let's see how you feel. Of the 3 students, of all of them, which one do you think would be the most well-behaved? Student 1, 2, or 3? Well-behaved. Give you a few seconds. All right, well, let's see the results. 78% of you thinks that student 1 would be the most well-behaved student in the class of these 3. All right, excellent. What about intelligence? Which of these students, if this was a class of 3 students, which student do you think would be at the top? A lot of you say student 1, student 3. All right, I'm happy someone's supporting student number 3. All right, the 3rd student is most intelligent. A lot of you say 2. Excellent. Okay. And now let's look at we'll take a vote on intelligence. Student 1, 2, or 3. Which one do you think would be the top of the class? All right, and the results. A lot of you voted for student 1 again, but student 3 gained a little more popularity this time. Student 1 still lagging behind. Okay. And effort. Hardworking. We're looking at which one of these students may not be the most intelligent or best behaved, but they try the hardest. Which one do you think? All right. And we'll close the poll. Let's see what the results were. Student 1, by far the most popular on being thought of as the top of the class. Okay, excellent, very good. So, in reality, we don't know which one of these students would be the top or the bottom. They're stock photos from the internet. I don't have the answer. So this was just an activity of looking at your impressions and what you think just based on a picture. So there's this concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a prediction that you make that becomes true just because you predicted it due to the expectation or a possible change in your behavior from merely predicting that it would happen. So I want you to think back to a time when you were unfairly judged. How did it make you feel? How did that prejudice affect your attitude, your effort, your motivation, or your outcome? Again, if you are with people, you can talk about it. If you're on your own, then just reflect in your head about that time and how you responded to some sort of negative judgment or criticism. In the example that I gave you, from what I told you, the reaction could go 2 different ways. Some people decide that they want to work harder. They want to prove that person wrong. You judged me harshly, and I will show you you were wrong. I, on the other hand, from the example I gave you, lived up to the low expectation. The bar was set low, so I didn't work that hard. And I think that is what happens a lot with students in the classroom when they feel that the teacher doesn't believe they can do something or not challenging them to work harder instead of them working hard to prove them wrong. I think a lot of people just live up to that low expectation. So I want to talk about a study that is quite old now, and it's about over 40 years old, but it's very familiar to people who have worked in education. It's debated, the methods are questionable, and it hasn't been replicated, but a lot of people know about it. So just a show of hands. Again, this is a virtual hand, not a physical hand. So raise your hand if you have heard about this study. Looks like a lot of you have heard about this study. That's excellent. Then I don't need to spend a lot of time explaining it. Not everyone, but yeah, all right. It looks like a lot of you are familiar with the concept of it. And that's excellent. Okay. A good mixture. Maybe not everyone knows. Okay. Well, oh, maybe it is new for a lot of people. Okay. I'll tell you about the study. For those of you who know, excellent. If you don't know, here's the idea behind it. Put some hands down. So this study was done, like I said, about 40 years ago, where the researchers went into a school and they selected some classes. They gave the students in these classes an IQ test, essentially, that they told the teachers was going to measure their intelligence and their learning potential. Within the classrooms, they randomly selected 20% of the students. Again, I stress these were randomly selected. On the actual test, they did not show any unusual potential for intellectual gain, but the researchers told the teachers that they did. They lied to them. They made it up. But what the interesting thing that happened is that 8 months later, that group that they selected randomly of these students who were about to have some intellectual boom actually did better. They did significantly better on the IQ test the second time. Again, I say that there's no actual reason for them to do better, but when they were tested later, they tested all significantly higher. So why do you think that is? If there's no actual reason for them, if they didn't actually score higher, then why do you think that they did 8 months later? So in the chat box, what factors do you think could account for their academic success? Why were these randomly selected students, why did they excel so much more than the others who weren't randomly selected? You can think about it, discuss it. Let me see. They had a good impression of themselves, motivational factors. Okay. Maybe it was a flaw in the study. Yeah. So it could have been a validity issue. The teachers paid more attention to them. Motivation seems to be a popular issue. Self-motivation. Now remember, the students were not aware that they had been given this undue title. Perseverance, interest. All right, good. All right, their own will to learn. Positive reinforcement. Excellent. Teachers treated them differently because of the expectations. Yeah, excellent. So there's a lot of ideas on what could account for these greater gains in this small percentage of students that were selected. So the conclusion of the study was what a lot of you had guessed, which was the teacher expectations and the teacher behavior. The teacher thought that these students were going to perform better and that they were smarter, so they treated them differently. They held them to a higher standard than the other students. So as a result of this study, the researchers were able to identify 4 main categories of teacher behavior. One being the socio-emotional climate, or the teacher warmth. Another being the input, or task orientation. Another being the output. And finally, the feedback. So just to give you an example of what I mean for each category, the teacher warmth or the climate of the classroom are things like how the teacher smiles or nods, the friendliness, the rapport with the teacher, the student, the general atmosphere of the classroom. The input refers to the input from the teacher to the students. So that's the amount of interaction that the teacher has, the amount of information that's given, the tasks that are given to the students, how difficult they are, the variety of them. That's all has to do with the input that the students receive. The output is the output of the student. So the opportunities that the student has for production. So these are things like calling on the student in class discussions, how often the student's called on. The wait time for student response, how much time the teacher, after asking a question, gives the student to respond. Do they let you think about it, or if you don't have an immediate answer, they move on? Another time are another output is opportunities for interaction. So how often and in what capacity are the students able to interact and produce whatever it is that the topic happens to be? And finally, feedback. This is the amount of criticism they receive and also praise on the other side. So it's not only the amount, but also the basis for. So maybe they receive a lot of criticism, but for what reason? Or on the other side, a lot of praise, but for what reason? And then the final type of feedback, which we're going to go into a little more in depth later, is pity or anger, which is expressed for a low performance, which refers to the emotion that causes, from the teacher, that would cause that kind of feedback. And again, we'll talk about that a little later. So self-efficacy is another concept that is not new to teachers, or especially language teachers. And that refers to the extent that an individual believes that he or she can successfully complete a task or accomplish a goal. So in the picture that you see, this adorable little kitten has a very high level of self-efficacy. He looks in the mirror and he sees himself as a mighty lion. Now, self-efficacy is a very personal and internal feeling. It refers to how one person feels about himself and his own ability to complete a task, to accomplish a goal, to do whatever it is he's trying to do. However, there's a lot of external factors that greatly influence that internal feeling of self-worth, self-confidence, ability, efficacy. And that external factor is what the researchers in the study I was telling you about referred to as a Pygmalion effect, which is that higher expectations would lead to higher performance. And on the other side of that, low expectations would lead to a low performance. So although this kitten has high self-efficacy, it's probably because this kitten's mother would tell him every chance she got how great he is, how strong he is, how powerful he is, and that affects the way that he ultimately sees himself and how he can accomplish whatever goal or task he's trying to set out for. which goes to teacher beliefs and feedback and the environment that you create with the students. These students are actually students from a COAR I visited in La Libertad here in Peru. They were a lot of fun, so I put their picture up because we had a good time with them that day. So if any of the teachers from there are participating, hello. Now, feedback is something important that a lot of teachers consider in their classroom. And the expectation that you have of students is reflected in feedback, sometimes unintentionally. How you feel about a student affects the way that you interact with that student and how you may respond to them, both positively and negatively on both sides of it. So again, something to think about, going back to this pity-anger idea, is in response to a student's low performance, when might you be sympathetic to a student answering incorrectly, misbehaving, whatever it may be? When might you be sympathetic to a situation where a student's performance was poor? And on the other side, when might you show anger or frustration to a student's poor performance? We'll give you a couple seconds. Again, if you are with others, discuss it. If you're on your own, just think in your head. And I'll give you a scenario to better illustrate what I mean for those of you who might be struggling with the concept. So let's say that you're in class and you're doing a review activity where you've been talking for maybe a week on how to describe, or longer, on how to describe family, age, whatever it may be, and a student comes to you with a sentence like this that has a lot of errors in the spelling, in the verbs, in collocation, full of errors. Now, in one situation, you might have student A, who is a low performer. The student often pays attention and rarely misbehaves, but the scores are always consistently low to mediocre. Some of the teachers in the school are talking and they believe that he might have a learning disability. So in response to the example that I showed you previously, the teacher might say, "Oh, good try, that was hard, but don't worry, you'll get it." Whereas student B is a high performer, scores consistently in the highest on testing, but doesn't take class very seriously. Often very chatty, off topic, comes from a good family, and the parents are always involved. In this case, the teacher gives a response of, "No, come on, we talked about this, focus and think about it." It's the same error, the same mistake, but two different students from two different scenarios with two different feedbacks. So compare the two examples of feedback from the teacher. Think about, how does student A differ from student B? And again, you can put your ideas in the chat box there. What makes student A different from student B? So anger may come from seeing no intention to change. Some people want to see it again. All right, I'll show you the two students again. Again, you have student A, the low performer, pays attention, rarely misbehaves, scores consistently low, possible learning disability. Student B, high performer, doesn't take class very seriously, chatty, but comes from a good background. And there's okay. So an estimation of effort is what some people say. Go. Okay. Cognitive problems are one factor. The feedback changes, student confidence, learning processes are different. Great. So, which response do you feel is more effective? And again, we'll do a hand raising. If you think that response A for student A, the sympathetic answer, the sympathetic response is more effective, raise your hand. Not a lot of people like the sympathetic response. Okay. Hands down. All right, what about feedback B, which was a little more stern? If you thought that that was more effective, then raise your hand on that one. A little more popular. Okay. Excellent. So, like a lot of you had put into the chats that I was seeing, it's this idea of where the emotion behind the emotion behind the feedback. And a lot of times when you pity a student or you show a sympathetic feedback, it's due to an emotional response from something uncontrollable, like a learning disability, a poor family background. Whereas anger is something that the student could control, a lack of effort, motivation, whatever it is. So the feeling that you have for the student and the expectation that you have for the student is reflected in the feedback. A lot of times when you don't even think that it's being reflected, it is being reflected. So to sum up, what does it all mean in the end for us as classroom teachers? So from the experience that I told you about as a student, and from my experience as a teacher, and then the research that I did for this, some tips came to mind on some takeaways that I take with me to the classroom. So one being to check your prejudices at the door, to make sure that the judgments that you make, or if you remember from the first activity, don't go with you into the classroom. I think as humans, we tend to have first impressions. We tend to judge, and I think that's natural. But the problem comes when those feelings start to affect the way that you treat people, and that's when it becomes a problem. The next is to truly believe that what you do is important and to strive for personal excellence. So as English teachers, we are doing very important work. English teachers are not only teaching the content of language, but they're also teaching a lot of communication skills, interpersonal skills, confidence building, not to mention writing, reading, any skill, any topic that you touch on with language is something that we as English teachers are able to cover. And what we do is incredibly important as educators. So as teachers, it's important to strive for the best in ourselves and in our students, which goes to the next point of expecting the most out of all of your students, holding everyone to an equally high standard. The next is taking time to build community in the classroom, making sure that people feel comfortable, that people feel safe, people want to take risks, that it's a place where if they make a mistake, they don't feel like they'll be judged harshly or criticized. They can be themselves, they can try something new, and there won't be any negative effect of it. And finally, be mindful of your feedback. That's feedback that's verbal and nonverbal. Sometimes your face or your body language speaks louder than the words you actually say. And both positive and negative. Because when you're always giving a student positive feedback, they may not want to try that hard as we saw from the example, because it may think that everything's just going to get the sympathetic response. Whereas on the other side, you don't want to be overly critical, because from the experience I told you about, it'll make someone turn away from the class that you're teaching. So with that, I thank you for joining us for today's webinar. These will be held every month. Next month, the presenter will be Matilda from Salta, Argentina. She is also a fellow who is there. And she will be talking about using selfies in the classroom. The date that we have is December 16th. That will be a Wednesday, 3 o'clock Lima time. We will get invitations out shortly. If you do not get one in the coming weeks, feel free to contact us and we'll be sure to add you to the mailing list. So once again, I thank you all for joining us and for your participation. For our first webinar, it was an excellent experience. For those of you who have to go, since we are running a little over, I thank you again. And again, the contact for us is at Relo Andes. Relo Andes, like you see under the mountain, but with no space, at state.gov. You can also find us on Facebook,
Twitter,
and Twitter. Okay, so for those of you who have to leave, thank you. Please take part in the survey so that we know where you joined us from and how many of you there were. If you can stick around for another 5-10 minutes and you have any questions or comments or discussion that you'd like to have with us as a group, then now is the time. So if you have any questions, anything you'd like to discuss, add, please let us know through the chat box. And the survey you'll find when the webinar closes, there should be an automatic link to it. Thank you all for joining.